This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bernard Milson from TSG Training. Thanks very much for joining us today. The session today is about virtual delivery presentation. And a lot of people said, what is virtual delivery? Essentially, it's the same as being in a classroom. You have your own tutor in real time. Things happen in real time. The course is exactly the same as it would be in a classroom, except you're not sitting in a classroom, you're at home. So we thought it's important to demonstrate today how this is going to work. John, next slide, please. John's principal trainer. He's been with me for about 20 years. Excellent fellow, knows his stuff. Has converted our courses from classroom to virtual learning, where to our great pleasure, we found that the results are no different in exam passes than they were for people taking in the classroom. So no loss of results, no real change in facilities. It's just the same training that we've always given you to the same quality. So rather than listen to me ramble anymore, I'm going to hand over to John, who knows far more about this than I do. So John, please go ahead.
Thanks, Bernard. So good afternoon, everybody. As Bernard mentioned, so I'm one of the principal trainers at TSG Training. So what we're going to do in this session is just give you an idea of what's different in virtual lessons. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about how we've approached teaching in a virtual situation that's slightly different to the classroom. And then to give you a taster, I'm going to do an extract from part of the foundation course. So I'm just going to do a bit of a mini lesson for boundary value analysis. Less to teach you about it, but more to show you how the actual lessons work. So I don't know if you've used GoToMeeting before, but you may have noticed I've got my video feed switched off. So if you go to the top of your GoToMeeting screen, and if you select hide everyone, then you're going to get a bigger view of this shared screen, which is what we do for people in the classroom. So we are maximizing the bandwidth of the network by not getting people to do shared video. But what we're doing then is giving people the biggest chance to see what we're actually presenting on screen. Well, Bernard said, what we do different in virtual lessons is as little as possible, because what we've been trying to do since the start of the lockdown is give people an effective learning experience. So, I mean, I think the first course I did virtual was literally in the middle of the classroom course when the government advice said, don't come to the office. So we got emails from people saying, I don't want to come to the office tomorrow. Is there any way we can do this virtually? So we have to kind of adjust quickly. So essentially, we're going to do a lot of the same things. Some of the things that we do differently, first of all, we make sure everyone's got a soft copy of the courseware. That's sent them before the course, so that as we're going along in the class, they've got the same manuals. If I want to refer to things, then I've got PDF copies of things like the course reader, and I can talk people through the contents. Now, what I'm doing is I'm just exploiting the tools in GoToMeeting. So if I want to say people, you know, this is really important, then I can highlight the issues that we're into. I can add comments. So have to, okay, say read this. And you may have noticed in the GoToMeeting environment, you've got a little image of a camera on the right-hand side of your screen, so you can take screenshots. So what we're trying to do is, for example, minimize the amount of time people spend writing notes and allow them to ask questions and listen. And if I annotate both either copies of the manual or the slides, then people are able to take screenshots whenever they need. So to allow that to happen, everyone's got the soft copy of the materials. So it's good to be able to have a decent sized monitor to see what we're doing when we're showing the screens. So I'm just going to erase that ink and go back to my PowerPoint presentation. Now, I'm a big fan of the whiteboard, and one of the things that really worried me about if I'm doing virtual lessons, how do I get the point across when I love scrolling all over boards? And it just occurred to me we can do this with PowerPoint. So I use a scratch pad so I can make notes and explain things, whoops, as we go along. So hello everyone. And what I'm using is, I haven't got a nice fancy touchscreen laptop. I've got a little digitizing tablet and a pen, and I write as we go along, so people can get the same. I can illustrate and articulate ideas through these virtual whiteboards. And again, the idea is then people have got the ability to screen grab that as much and as one as they need to. So I'm just going to erase that ink. Get myself back to my pen. Just come back to the main PowerPoint presentation again. So basically what we're doing is we're flipping between PowerPoint presentations. Now, as I just mentioned, students get the option to take screenshots. Now, one of the big differences with a virtual classroom is you're staring at a screen, you're working from home. And so what we've essentially done is we've modified the schedule, and we're allocating a lot more breaks. So on average, every hour and 15, we're doing a 10-minute breather. If people need a break, I can accommodate that. Now, I've noticed, and this is the normal case, everybody has the microphones muted unless they want to ask a question. So we're using the chat screen, so you can ask a question via chat, but most people are comfortable just basically chipping in. So the whole intention of this is to get away from the distance learning kind of passive way of doing things, and to allow people to interrupt me, stop, ask me to go back. I can re-explain things. I can break out to my whiteboard if necessary. So also just acknowledging the fact that you're absorbing information at a different rate. Whereas in the classroom courses, we've usually scheduled the exam towards the latter part of the last day of the course. What we're doing is we're giving people a couple of days work time to do their exam preparation. We're scheduling the exam usually around 2 working days after the end of the course delivery. We're mainly asking people, mainly these days, we're using remote exams. And Bernard, when we do Q&A later on, Bernard can clarify what happens with the way the exams work. But what we're tending to do nowadays is the easiest thing to do is give somebody an exam date to aim at as soon as the delivery is possible. But we're just recognizing when you're in this kind of this mode of learning, some people just need a little bit longer sometimes to go back to the materials and do some practice exercises. So I'm just going to now do a demonstration of a little bit of the teaching we do. So I'm going to give an extract from some things you may be familiar with from the ISTQB Foundation level course. I'm just going to do an extract from the lesson on boundary value analysis. So let's talk about some testing. So boundary value analysis is an extension, an enhancement of the equivalence partitioning technique. Now that's based on the principle that we take information from requirements and we break them into groups that behave similarly, partitions or classes. The argument there being we can reduce the number of tests. If I can reduce 20,000 tests into 3 groups, then 3 test cases is a lot less than 20,000, as long as I've understood the requirements well. Now, having said that, the boundary value analysis technique comes around because we recognize the edges, the boundaries of partitions, it's more likely where we're going to get a problem, we're going to get a mistake. So if I just illustrate what I mean with my scratch pad. So if I go to a blank green, so for example, in the UK, the voting age at present is age 18. So I don't know if you've ever asked a teenager, how old are you? And you get the question, I'm nearly 18. You say, but how old are you? And they say they're 11. So years, and I might want to say as integers. So we're talking about whole years. So the thing about that requirement, if we said, let's make sure you can only vote if you are 18, is I could code that saying, as long as you are greater than or equal to 18, then we can make sure the people who are allowed to vote can vote, and the people who shouldn't be voting shouldn't vote. But either a requirements writer or a developer could implement that doing, for example, greater than 17. And this is often where the boundary problems arise, either because somebody verbally said, make sure they're over 17, and then they code it doing greater than 18. Because they issue that same thing. Now that will give me the partition be placed incorrectly, or somebody codes or find and replace, copy and paste, and what we get is somebody accidentally implements greater or equal to 17, we get 17-year-olds able to vote. Or people use not less than 18. So again, the programmers may actually get the algorithm wrong, or they may pick the wrong value from the requirement. And the other problem we get is the one that always drives me crazy, the petrol pumps. So if I say the price of unleaded is 10.9.99, is that going to be implemented on 1 decimal place or 3 decimal places? Is some going to offer me 0.0.1 back pennies? That'd be nice. It doesn't really happen often. So we get problems with boundaries either because people define the boundary incorrectly, or they implement the wrong logical operator, or we get the order of magnitude wrong between the groups. And this is the problem that boundary value analysis is trying to flush out. So the behavior on these boundaries, these edges, these partitions, is more likely to be a problem. So let's define a boundary. And ISTQB have defined boundaries in a very nice, unambiguous way. The maximum and minimum inclusive values of the partition are those ones that are most likely to identify defects. So that's what we're going to focus on with this technique. Now, it's applicable to all situations: component testing, integration testing, system testing, acceptance testing, anywhere you've got partitions which are ordered sets. I don't know if you've come across that stage, an ordered set. Ranges that increment regularly. So I need to find some information out, and if it's not there, this technique is going to help pinpoint that problem for me. I just noticed, Amanda, you asked a question: did the delegates see the instructor presenting during the course? Well, we don't do that, mainly because you don't really want to see my face. But what we're trying to do, well, that's me, that's what I think. But actually, it's mainly to make sure we keep the bandwidth. So we're not cluttering things up with video images, and we're then able to maximize the desktop space for the lecture and the information we're trying to communicate. So although you could do video sharing, that's not the approach we've taken. Now, as we're sorry, that's the whole reason we're encouraging with people. Although, like, you've all got your mics muted, I will not deliberately mute people. And if somebody wants to interrupt and ask a question, I encourage that. Now, of course, the one difference with the way we're doing audio on a virtual meeting is people just have to follow some of the etiquette. So again, try and make sure people don't all talk at the same time. But most people are used to that these days, and I haven't really come across that as a problem, even when we've had big groups. So I hope that answers your question. Now, the other thing that's important about boundary value analysis with ISTQB is we've got two approaches. We've got the 2 points per boundary approach and the 3 points per boundary approach. But what's common to both is we've got this definition of a boundary as the maximum and minimum exclusive, or inclusive rather, values of a partition. Now, in the 2-value approach, we test the boundary of one partition with the boundary of another partition. So let me just explain what that means. I'll come back to applying the technique in a second. So if I've got a requirement, so input field should accept a single-digit integer. We input for your numeric keypad, and the system should accept 1 to 5 inclusive, reject other inputs. So if I took that requirement and started doing some boundary modeling, then if there's my requirement, then the first thing I'm interested in are the valid boundaries. So what I mean by valid are things that should be accepted by the system, should be processed. So this requirement says the input field to accept a single-digit integer. The system should accept 1 to 5 inclusive and reject other inputs. So this is my minimum boundary, and this is my maximum boundary for this partition. And this is a valid partition because the specification says you can input between 1 and 5 inclusive. Now, that implies that 6 and above is invalid. And it also applies that 0 and below is invalid. So what we do with the 2-value approach is I test the boundary for one partition, 5, with the boundary for in the adjacent partition, in this case 6. And I'll test 1, the valid boundary, with 0. So if I made an inventory of boundaries, then I say the valid boundaries for this partition are 1 and 5, and the invalid boundaries are 0 and 6. Now, I'm just going to explain where to-value comes from. And once you know that, you can effectively forget it. But what the technique says, we test the value on the boundary with the value from the next partition, the next boundary. So I test 1 with 0, and I test 5 with 6. They're my two values. Now, if I was only interested in testing the valid partition, that's the job done. But if I was also interested in testing that the invalid partitions are being placed correctly, and I wanted to focus those as well, then I would test 0 with 1, and I would test 6 with 5. So this is being nice and academically tight. There are actually 2 tests for each boundary. Now, in practice, when I test the valid boundary 1, and I test the values 1 and 0, then I've already run those 2 tests. So I'm not actually going to create 2 additional test cases, because these are effectively redundant. But they've been considered in the technique. And if I had to show it to a regulator, this was something safety critical, here's my evidence, I've thought things through. Likewise, if I test the upper boundary 5 with 6, then I don't need to repeat the test if I was focusing on 6, because they're both redundant. So in the 2-value approach, what you essentially do is you test the boundaries. Now, that's adequate for medium to low risk. It's making sure we've over-tested, we've tested more than just the values inside the partition. We're focusing on not only is the partition placed correctly, but how do you check that the invalid partitions have been included as well. Now, Amanda, I know you've said a benefit of the classroom is instructors can read how engaged the audience is. Now, the only way I can do this is ask people questions. But what we also do is I don't just do the theory, we give people practicals. And one of the things we've been doing in some of the applied techniques is if people have camera phones and they've got some paper, what I've done before now is ask people to photograph their analysis and mail it to me, and then we can share it as part of the classroom discussion. Now, I agree, we can't do everything we do in a classroom, but the best we can do is promote and ask people. So you're right, I can't be sure silence means people understand, but what we can do is be as proactive as possible, and recognize the limitations of what we've got in the environment we've got. To be honest with you, you can't guarantee that with video feeds either. So what we're trying to do is keep people as focused as possible. But this is a part of a partnership in that sense. Now, I don't know if what I've been doing at the moment is enough to explain how the lessons work, because essentially what I'd be doing if I carry on with the lesson from this point is I'd be picking back through and explaining the 2 points per boundary, the 3 points per boundary approach, and again with a bit of example, and also again asking people to ask questions or prompt answers. And that's why, just like in the classroom sessions, what we do, if I just flick through the slides quickly, having gone through the lecture, apply the technique, we also, everybody's got worked examples, these are also in their course manuals, but we then, having worked through the solutions, we then give people an actual problem to solve themselves. At this point, I'd be asking people to either verbally go through the answers, offer solutions, and we're often using multiple choice formats, or as I mentioned, what I've been doing quite recently, it just occurred to me, well, if you've got a camera phone and a piece of paper, and if you want to take a photograph and send it in by email, then I can share that and we can discuss that. I'm not forcing people to do that if they're not willing to do it, but I found some groups have been quite happy to do that, and it's a good way of, again, making sure people get themselves engaged. Now, that's essentially the way the classes work. So you can see it's a mixture of me annotating slides, talking to people, using the virtual whiteboard, and giving people time to do exercises and then feed things back to us. Just noticed Bernard just mentioned here, he says he's taken the course and the exam virtually, and he found, and that's quite good because Bernard's been on the receiving end of this, so that we're not just looking at it from my point of view. And he found that the engagement's been pretty good for all participants. Now, I think if everyone's comfortable, I think we're segueing into the Q&A session, because this is supposed to be a short period. So Bernard's mentioned that the pass rates we found haven't differed. So how does certified course of exams work online? Bernard, I think you're being familiar with the discussions of the exam bodies. Would you like to take that question?
Sure, John, of course.
Thanks.
Exams are arranged to be taken in much the same way as the course. Essentially, for a group course, we'll arrange an exam date. You will join that exam from the comfort of your own home, train, lounge, or wherever you happen to be. The process is essentially the same. There is a camera between you and the proctor to make sure of fair play. But essentially, it's the same as taking an exam in a classroom, just as the course is, except it's from the comfort of your own home. If you don't want to join a group exam, then that exam can be arranged for you at a time of your own choosing. There really is no change to the exam process except where you're sitting. So in terms of Michael Woods just asked, as alternative to question mark, yes, we can provide exams through ISTQB, who use the Flex platform. If you have a particular preference, then it would be helpful to know. Typically, we arrange things from the BCS, but we can arrange alternatives with ISTQB if your IT departments prefer to use Flex as a base rather than question mark. So I hope that answers questions for Karen and Michael. Thanks for those. If there's any more exam ones, please let me have them. John, I think this question is probably for you from Amanda, so I'll hand back.
Online videos to support learning. Well, essentially, what we're trying to do is we're not using the video format because we're using the actual classroom space to put the points across. So the intention is that they've got the course pack, which has got both copies of the slides, the notes, the theory, practical exercises. But what we do provide, if people want follow-up problems, if they've got issues, then basically all of us as trainers make sure we share our contact details, and if necessary, we'll follow up. Again, the nice thing about GoToMeeting is I can arrange if necessary, a video call or an on-time, real-time discussion. I mean, this is obviously out of hours, but we're quite happy to do it. So, whereas, I mean, one of the issues around videos is you've got to try and second guess everything in a video, and again, it's passive learning. So we tend not to use the video format in the classroom, so we're tending not to use the video format in the virtual learning as well.
John, if I could just chip in there, please.
Sure.
Obviously, while we're using slides for presentation and demonstration, etc., I do encourage you to say hi to the people facially before the course starts, so they know you and you can see them. There's another question from Craig Wiley. Based on your experience, what's the difference between past sites between online and in-person learning? Surprisingly, none. Great. So at my advanced years, I took the course and passed the exam first time, and other people seem to be doing the same thing. Again, it's up to the individual to make sure that they take on the learning and they're ready for the exam. And if they're not, we can postpone their exam much as we would do in the classroom for them if they weren't ready. Okay, John, I think there's probably no more questions, and unless you want to add anything, I think we'll wrap up and thank people for their time. It's great that you joined us all, and we hope that you'll come and see us soon. I know a lot of you are loyal to TSG training, and for that I appreciate your support. Thanks very much, everybody. We will send a copy of this this video to you, and it will be available on YouTube and our website as well. Thanks for your attendance, everybody. Thanks again, John. You can close this off now.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye.
And thanks, Bernard.
Yeah.